Ah, who is that? Oh, Eva, how did you manage to speak when I've got you muted?
You can speak in unmute.
Oh, right, you're taking life in your own hands. Yes, I will record as soon as we start. All right, I just want to check that some of the people that we've got here, Barry, Paul, Christine, Susan, and Diane and Agnieszka. Paul's with us. I just want to make sure that you're there. Well, maybe they'll join us when they finish their tea. Right. Okay. So I'm gonna I'm gonna press the record button and then we'll begin. Well, welcome everybody. And for those of us amongst us here this evening who are not aware of the context of these talks, they're given by group members of Philosophy as a Way of Life, which we've been running for a few terms now. And I think that those of us who attend will agree that we are actually onto an interesting area. We're looking at the way non-Dvaita manifests in the West. And with that, we're looking at the Platonic tradition, particularly at the Stoics, and their influences, and then in turn the influences that they've passed on to others. Now, the great thing about this group, apart from the fascinating topic, is that we get some really great people attending. And it did occur to me that it would be really wonderful for these people to make their contributions to a wider audience, because the contributions they make to the classes are so interesting. So up to now, we've been looking really in our classes at the nature of reason, because reason in its most profound sense is very important for the Stoics, as indeed it is important for the Platonists. But this coming term in September, we're now moving on to love, or more precisely, what became known after the Renaissance as Platonic love. And that is love without limit. And as such, this is obviously again and love. Now, given that that is our topic for next term, I thought, well, how does this express itself in people's everyday life, this idea of love without a limit? And of course, it expresses itself in a kind of generosity of spirit, a magnanimity. And therefore, the people that we've got speaking this evening are all of them in their different ways are magnanimous people, people who, as the title of the talks suggests, have a great interest in others, and in particular in supporting and caring for others. And so each in their own way, quite different, will be speaking about this very thing and how that has fed into their lives and nourished them, and how in turn it has led them to consideration of philosophy. And where does this philosophy that we study have a resemblance, a relationship to their life experience? So that's where we're starting from, but I'll say no more. The general format this evening will be each speaker will talk for about a quarter of an hour, prompted by a couple of relevant questions from myself. And then at the end, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And that will go on till about 8:15. So each speaker will speak for about a quarter of an hour. And then there will be the opportunity for you to put questions to a little panel of the three of them. So I hope all that is clear. And so our first speaker is Barbara. Barbara, speaker, so that we can see Barbara in her fullness. I
I am on speaker.
suggest you click on the speaker mode, and we can see you. And now everybody else can, if they pressed on that. Off you go, Barbara.
Okay. I did click on speakers, I'm not sure, but anyway, that was a good beginning, because I was going to talk about my career just very briefly, that I entered into social work very young and did quite a lot of work with older people, and then as a generic social worker, and then moved into training and training social workers and carers. And I've always been sort of interested in older people, mainly because I really value their stories, and I really, like their stories. So from social work, that was on my career. But on the personal level, I've always done some growth and development since I was a young woman. Meditation, therapy groups, individual therapy, lots of different things throughout, but not following a philosophy course. So that only started sort of 2 years ago. So when William talked about linking philosophy with what you've been doing, I thought, well, I can't really do that. Anyway, but throughout sort of working life and personal development, the question, what's my purpose, what's my meaning, has remained really to the forefront. In everything I've done, whatever it is, I've been looking for purpose and meaning. I just want to drop in a little example of when I was in Japan. I had a friend who was 100 years of life, and she said, curiosity, always being curious and willing to look round the next corner. And that for me was sort of such a sort of light bulb moment. It was fantastic. Moving on, I wanted to talk about the project that I became involved in Japan. But before that, in 2009, I had the opportunity to go abroad, and because my partner had an opportunity to work abroad, so we went, and I had retired by then. So we first of all went to China, and again, purpose and meaning. What am I going to do? I'm not going to work. How am I going to fill my time? And eventually, amongst other things, I went to an old people's home, a Chinese old people's home, and I volunteered there and worked with a social worker to provide activities for the home. And that was sort of absolutely fantastic. The Chinese old people were so willing to do anything and to get involved. So they would do circle dancing, we would play games, we did singing, lots of different activities. And just their enthusiasm and willingness to try something was inspiring. I then went to Canada, and I worked as a volunteer with people who had early onset Alzheimer's. And that was a sort of different experience, but again, gave me the sort of opportunity to think about purpose and meaning. And after that, we went to Japan. And it's that project that I wanted to talk about more fully.
I wonder, Barbara, if I could stop you for a moment.
Yeah.
Whether you could tell us how you started off and got involved in caring for others after you left school. Let's go back to the beginning, because this is jumping to the end. Let's have a look at the beginning of it all.
Well, I think I left school thinking, well, what am I going to do? I want to work with people, but I didn't have the qualifications when I left school to do that. So at the time, there was lots of jobs that you could get, and I got a job where I did meet people, but not very, very fully. And then I soon got another job working in a welfare department and decided that I wanted to do social work. And at that time, they sponsored you for the training. And so really that, I then had to go and get the exams to enable me to go on the course. But I did that. And I think because I had a destination that I wanted to get to, I had a purpose. And so I took the exams and I got the qualification and started working.
So you suddenly had an inspiration, a kind of path in life.
There's always inspiration, I think, when you look around and when you're involved with people. I mean, very early on in the social work days, I was involved with a lot of older people, and their stories were inspiring, like the woman of 100 in Japan.
Right. Well, I just want to know, what it is that actually enlivens somebody to take a path like the path that you've taken in life.
I think I just had some sort of, I'd like to work with people. But in those days, we didn't have a career path or sort of a career advisor. And it was just sort of floating around. How do I do that? How do I fulfill that, really?
Right. And did you find, I mean, clearly you started off from ground zero because you didn't have any qualifications or anything. But because you were inspired, you managed to get all those qualifications. And not only that, did you become work in social work, but you also became a trainer. Where did you do? Who did you train, and where did you train?
Well, in social work, you either become a senior social worker or you go into training, those sort of paths. And I just chose that path. And I worked in local authorities as a training consultant, working with social workers and mostly care staff. And I set up, at that time, there was the MVQ qualification that all care staff were doing. So I started a centre in Enfield in order to deliver that. And we've sort of trained, I don't know, hundreds of care staff over the years.
So all these carers and care staff have gone through your hands in one way or another.
Well, not all of them, unfortunately.
But a good proportion. That's
a good proportion, yeah.
So you got on to the point where you were saying you finished your career, you retiring, and then your life really started to take off. So tell us a little bit more about China and these wonderful people that you met.
Yes, I mean, it was something about being lucky to be introduced to places. I had a Chinese friend, and I really wanted to go into a Chinese old people's home. And she managed to do that for me. She managed to get, there wasn't a lot of rules. If you wanted to do something in China, you could more or less do it, if it was accepted. And so there wasn't the rules as there is in Japan. So she made the contact with the home and I went along and went from there. I mean, I worked with a social worker. I had no Chinese language. I worked with a social worker and we managed to do lots of activities because and what was interesting in the home was that the older people all had a role in that home. They all had a role. So some did sweeping, some did cooking. Everybody knew what they wanted to do, as well as interacting with each other, playing games. So the environment was there, and their enthusiasm and willingness to do something new was there.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds interesting. And where did you go to after China?
We were in Canada. There I wanted to do some work with the Alzheimer's. And so I went and was lucky enough to be able to run a group for people with early onset Alzheimer's. So I used my group work skills to be able to deliver that, really.
Oh, that's wonderful. So how long were you in Canada?
A year. And
Well, tell us.
it's quite a mix.
Well, it's fascinating. So you must have done an awful lot in Japan. So tell us a little bit about that. I'm going to have to nip away because there's so many people trying to get in that I'm going to sort them out. So you tell us about Japan and I'll be back with you.
And then, I wanted, I had arrived in Japan again, not with anything to do, no work, of course. And so I was clear I wanted to do something. And just by chance, a doctor who I was visiting, who became a friend, suggested that I visited a British guy who had Alzheimer's in a home. And so I started to visit him because the doctor felt that it would be good for me, for him to be able to talk English. And there wasn't anybody in the home that was English or had the, so much language, English language. So I started visiting him, and he was on the 4th floor, and this home is attached to a hospital. So it's an old people's facility attached to a hospital. I started visiting him and floor. And what I observed was that people were sitting around, not interacting, not doing anything. And one woman was actually sitting, looking at the wall. And whilst I observed all physical needs were being taken care of in a loving way, there was that element of mental well-being that I felt was really missing. And I found it very, very painful. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, what about being able to provide activities along some lines like we had in China? And I knew that there was some volunteers who volunteered for the hospital part, just really redirecting people, not doing anything very fulfilling. But there was a head of volunteers. She wasn't Japanese. I went to see her and I floated the idea of getting a group together of volunteers and providing something in the home. But
okay.
It's okay. But of course it's okay. It's very different in Japan. There's a lot of formality. You can't just go and do something if you've got an idea. There's a lot of hoops to go through. So the head of volunteers was interested and felt she could get a group together of volunteers. And so I presented the idea to a meeting of the Board of Governors, the managers from the home and senior medical staff. And I knew that I had to be really low key somehow, because all new ideas in Japan need to come from managers. And there's a very sort of hierarchical steps in terms of who is allowed to have the idea. And so I wanted to be very low key in terms of sort of saying, what you've got is you've got a staff group that's providing such a lot of care. And then you've got the sort of managers equally taking risks and, you know, providing the care, but volunteers could do just a small bit. They could add on with a small bit. And so I presented something very low key. This is just a sort of, this is the diagram. It has got love in it. I gave them all a copy of that diagram, so you can see that. But I talked about what volunteers might be able to offer. And anyway, I got the green light from that, and that was fantastic. They said, yeah, you know, go ahead, sort of set it up. And I met with the volunteers the head of volunteers had got together, and alongside that met with the managers from the home. And the volunteers were absolutely fantastic. They were so enthusiastic. They wanted, again, for them, purpose and meaning. They hadn't got it in what they were doing already. And within 2 sessions, they had sketched out a session for the activities. They just were brimming with ideas. That was inspiring. Alongside that, and then we got the second green light to start. And then there was fear. So that was interesting because the head, I don't think, and so she put lots of obstacles in the way of actually starting because she was very frightened of making a mistake and of treading on toes. So, the Japanese were always very, very forgiving. So I was able to take her fear and say, let's do it anyway. Let's try it. And so that's what we did. We tried the first session, we jumped in. The volunteers were absolutely fantastic. And it worked. And what we did was to do things like singing and games and storytelling and getting people to interact with each other. Before they had been sitting around not interacting, and that's could be very Japanese way of culturally of being. And within a sort of short space of time, I was able to stand back and let a new leader, if you like, emerge. Very quickly that happened. And the group continued to flourish, meeting twice monthly. It just sort of flourished and went on from that time 6 years. I knew I had to.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Now, one final question before we move on to the next speaker. Is there anything briefly you could say about what your life experience has been and how you came in your latter years, as it were, to take up philosophy? You mentioned it at the beginning. I was half attending to about half a dozen people trying to get in.
Well, I think that when you said try and link your life to philosophy,
Yeah.
I thought, God, I haven't got a clue. You know, in a way, I still feel that. But I guess purpose and meaning is a philosophical question. Well, I think when I came back to the UK after being away for 6 years, I wanted to take up philosophy, learning more about it. I don't know why. I didn't have a thought out reason to do that. I just felt it was the right thing.
That's interesting, because for those of you who don't know much about Stoicism, two of the fundamentals that we base the course on is that we're not alone but part of the whole.
Yeah.
And as such, we have a duty of care one for another. And this, I think this story, what appealed to me about it was such a beautiful example of just those two fundamental things. Great. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. That was lovely. And now we'll move on to Eva. Now, Eva, so I'm going to unplug you, as it were. Eva has spent her career as an international cultural guide, in which a job in which she's had to do a considerable amount of care for others. And I can assure you, international guides have a rich body of stories to tell about their experiences. So I'm now going to hand over to Eva. So over to you, Eva. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, welcome from Poland, where I am at the moment, and where I'm going to talk to you about the caring, people's caring aspect of my job. Although if you look at the title, International Tour Guide, probably it is not immediately connected in this way as, for example, Barbara's job has been, because it comes up, probably this very aspect comes up in the most dramatic situations. Normally, the job entails culture, history, organization, keeping to the program, carrying it out. Whatever happens, the show has to go on. But happens, it does. Especially when you take a group of 46 people out into Europe, and to let you know, my guests would come usually from the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually South Africa. So it would be a mixture usually of 5 nationalities, and we would travel. I started the job in 1984, which means, well, the communism was still well in healthy, and the itineraries I would cover would be mostly through Eastern and Central Europe, including the Soviet Union, which was then very Soviet. And people needed visas to enter Eastern European countries. It entailed lining up at borders. And actually, this very lining up at borders gave me a very, very good idea, because for those very borders, I needed to prepare a passport list with all the details. And to get those details, I was distributing pink forms at the beginning of the tour on which people were supposed to fill in their passport details. The reverse of the pink form was always blank. And I've come with this inspired and very practical idea to ask them to write on the reverse of the form some personal information that they imagined would help me better look after them. And to tell you the truth, this has proved an amazing benefit for both the parties, for the guests and for myself, because already on the second day of the tour, I would know who recently underwent surgical procedures, who was claustrophobic, who was diabetic, who didn't have any sense of orientation, who was in mourning. There were all kinds of human situations. And as I started, my biggest worry was at that stage that not always I knew all the places I had to take the people to, while the company was assuring them of an experienced tour director. But the tour director needed to get the experience. I was experienced, let's say I had culture, history knowledge, I spoke languages, but it's not always that I knew all the places I was taking people to begin with. So obviously, this was my biggest worry. What I understood already on the third tour of my life, about which I'm going to tell you, was that the places and the knowledge of the places was only half. The second equally important part was how to handle personal situations while on tour. And this very tour that I'm going to tell you, which made me understand that, and which formed me as maybe a slightly different, a little bit more psychological, philosophical tour director from comparing, let's say, my attitude with the one of my colleagues, was the tour of 1984, which was called Oberammergau Special. Oberammergau is a little village in southern Bavaria, where for now, about 390 years, people have been, it's altogether 2,000 people who are the villagers, have been performing a passion play to commemorate the events of 1634, when they made a vow due to the fact that their village of Oberammergau was spared from the bubonic plague. And since then, every 10 years, they would perform that play. And to that very play, I took a group of 42 people from South Africa. They were all veterans of the Second World War, and they were coming with a special program. The program involved visiting war cemeteries where they lost their friends during the Second World War. And since it was 40 years since those battles of 1944, they were participating in all kinds of military events, ceremonies taking place in very important places like the Triumphal Arch, etc., Piazza Venezia in Rome, and so on. Plus, there was the purely touristic itinerary of various countries of Western Europe. Plus, there was this very passion play in Oberammergau. Let me tell you, to cut this story to the very most important core of it all, out of 42 that I took on tour, I brought back 38. The 4 people that I have in mind, out of them 2 died within 3 days, and 2 suffered. One, a very serious accident, falling down on stone stairs from Palazzo Vecchio going direction Santa Croce in Florence. Another one suffered terribly of ulcers and had to be sent home from Rome to Durban. So how I handled these situations, let me tell you, it was only my 3rd tour in my life. I was still a greenhorn. I would sleep 4 to 5 hours a night, getting ready for the next day, studying the itinerary, studying the information. However little time I had, I was doing my best. It was in the time there were no mobile phones, there was no help of internet. It was all with books and help that I had, thank God, from a friend who traveled on a parallel coach with another 44 people. And the first person who died, it happened in Salzburg. It was a heart attack. For these people, death was maybe not so new. They were all war veterans. For me, it was. And it was me who was taken with the victim, who was at that stage still alive, to the hospital. The hospital staff, the emergency, I got to the hotel. Before I informed the office, I knew the most important, my mission was to pass it on as gently as possible to the woman. She was a widow. Now, I did it. She took it pretty well, but then she said that the next day she wanted to fly with the body from Salzburg to South Africa on her own by plane. I said there was absolutely no way we could do that because she didn't have any insurance. There were a lot of formalities to be carried out. She didn't speak any German, and I couldn't stay with her. I had to carry on with the remaining people and carry out the program, which was extremely difficult and rich and complicated. So I spent about, probably an hour and a half in a role of a tour guide turned a priest. I was a spiritual leader for her at that moment, and I needed to explain to her that her husband was a spirit and that it didn't matter for him whether he returned to South Africa as a body, corpse, or as ashes, and that the only thing we could do, we had to have him cremated, and that he is a spirit and he's going to come with us anyway. He is accompanying the tour. We all love him. All those people knew one another. This was, the fantastic aspect of it. They were all from South Africa. They all fought together in the Second World War. So they were supporting the widow. And so I said, we all love him. He's with us. And believe me, it is much easier to have him cremated. And although my duty, was to make sure that the cremation took place and the ashes were to be sent to the House of South Africa in Trafalgar Square and then eventually to be collected by her, I spent much more time looking after the widow than the formalities connected with the corpse. Every evening, I would find time to listen to her, what her thoughts were, what her problem was, and the whole group, offered their support as well, which was brilliant. And then 3 days later, we got to Oberammergau. The second death was much easier. It was because the lady had suffered from asthma and she was a chain smoker. On the day we got there, she was already feeling very bad. So I called the doctors that they gave an injection, told her to rest. When we came back from the Passion Play, the house was, closed. There was boarding on it and said, not to touch. The lady was dead. And there was only what was left with me was now a detective work, because she was traveling on her own. We didn't know who her next of kin was. And one more thing that I want you to know, all these things always happen either on Saturday or Sunday, which is, of course, the most difficult day to do anything. But by that stage, a boss of mine came and said he was going to look after the second case. And then we got to Florence. And this was probably the more difficult job, because in Florence, this wonderful lady who traveled with her husband fell down the stairs and fell on her face, and with her very thick, heavy spectacles cutting into her nose getting broken in a few places. And then what arrived at that stage was not the type of emergency service like I had in Salzburg, but the Misericordia service of, and this is like, remembering the plague. They look like Ku Klux Klan, dressed in long robes with kind of, ropes in their waistline with the hoods. And when she saw them, she thought this was it. She was gone. She thought they came to take her away. I thought the same. I almost fainted, but fortunately I knew who they were. They took us to the hospital, and eventually after the x-ray, it transpired, that she had to stay in the hospital and wait for a few days before the operation, because her nose was so swollen they couldn't operate immediately. The problem was that in those days, hardly anybody spoke English in the Italian hospitals. So I could leave her, and she was all right with that. But I knew, from they were all the age of my parents. I said, there's nobody to visit this woman. How is she going to communicate with these doctors? And fortunately, I studied in Florence a few years before, and I had a very, very lovely friend who was of Polish origin, who spoke beautiful English. And I asked her as a personal favor to come and visit this lady. And you won't believe it, not only she would oblige, but she actually made friends with this lady. And they corresponded a few years afterwards, and she would visit her every day. So this was beautiful. The problem for me was that the lady traveled with a brother. The brother was not quite there, a little bit Alzheimer, but taking a lot of pills. And she was the one who would administer the pills. Now that she stayed in Florence, who was to give the pills? Me. On top of all the job that I had to find the war graves, throughout Europe, I had to feed him the pills. But I knew it was as important as finding those cemeteries. And then eventually, after I sent the last person, this was the one who had the ulcers, back to South Africa, we were 38. And this taught me one thing. When they were 42 and the coach was 49, I was counting 7 ghosts. And I was saying, when I had 7 ghosts, meaning 7 empty seats, which means everybody was present. After that experience, I never counted empty places. They are only counted, and I never called the empty places ghosts. Anyway, this was my what I learned. Apart from being a priest on that tour, and apart from being organizer and detective and whatever you have, I also had a job of a prosthetic dental technician, because the guy who was a banner carrier, the wonderful man, the one who suffered from ulcers, one day put something into my hand and said, "Can you please fix it?" I said, "Of course," although I didn't know what it was. When I opened my hand, I saw something I never had in my hand before. It was broken denture. I had to fix that as well. So I got my driver to get me super glue, and next day he got his denture back. Anything is possible for a tour guide. So this was this memorable tour that, taught me a lot. And I understood, whether they are 42 or 49, that each of them is an individual who's first of all taken out of their comfort zone, far away from their family, far away from their home, and that no question, no problem, no query, is too little for me. And that if only I can find the time, I would treat it seriously and accommodate their needs. So this personal treatment and my handling of those 4 cases, I think, was first of all what saved that tour, but second of all, also what saved my decision to carry on in the profession. Because when I started it on my first tour, I was doing 5 capitals, and Switzerland was the title of the tour. Of all those places, I knew one, which was Paris. All the others I was going for the first time on my first tour. It was some places like Luxembourg and Bonn. So to tell you the truth, my boss said to me very reassuringly, he said, if I put you on deep water, I said, I don't know these places. He said, if I put you on deep water, you will learn to swim fast or you will drown. So drown I did not, because this year on 12th of September, I'm taking my next tour, and you won't believe it, I'm taking them again to Oberammergau. It's again an Oberammergau special passion play, because it couldn't be run in 2020 because of the pandemics. Clever Germans moved it not 1 year, but by 2 years to 2022. So I will be taking these people now, all of them from Canada, to Zurich, to Lucerne, to Neuschwanstein, Munich, then flying to Dubrovnik, and before that, of course, Oberammergau, and Dubrovnik, Medjugorje, Zagreb, and finishing in the capital of Croatia.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think your time is up.
Thank you.
I'm sure you could go on all night telling us these glorious stories. One question I'd like to put to you. I mean, all of that is absolutely fascinating, and immediately springs to mind that there are two features of our course which link in perfectly with that. And that is living in the present. And it's not what happens to you that's important. It's how you
react, how you take it, and how you react. And you know, and one last thing, if I can say, also this added value of your heart, that if you wish to, you have a choice, you can give this tiny little bit more, which is called heart and imagination and feeling. And this is what makes all the difference.
Oh, that's wonderful. And that is a very, very reassuring end to your talk, because that's exactly what we're beginning to look at next term. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. I'm sure there'll be some questions later. But now let's go on to Luigi, who's the third of our speakers. Luigi. If I can.
Yes.
Ah, there you are. Great. So Luigi, if you'd had a little look at the notes, is a successful businessman who decided in his prime, not that he's not in his prime at the very moment, but to turn his back on his successful business career and ended up working for NGOs in Africa. And again, this is a fascinating story, and one that is highly relevant to all the things that we've been discussing in our group. So I'm now going to hand over to Luigi, and he can tell us his story.
Thank you, William. I was born in Italy at the end of the Second World War, and I grew up the second of 5 children in a poor family. Of those years, there were a few aspects that left their mark on my future. My father was a street vendor, and his meager daily income was barely enough to provide food for the family. But also he had a habit of never giving my mother more than 500 Italian lire every morning. Something like £5 today, even when he could have given more. So my poor mother was never able to buy provisions for more than 1 day at a time. He also used to buy house furniture on credit, paid by installments. But he forgot or decided, I never knew, not to pay the last one, so that the furniture was distrained by the vendor and the house left empty. And this happened more than once. Poor mother became crazy. My father, from a family of peasants in the deep south of Italy, I can say had a very peculiar way of running the family. To the point that sometimes it became quite crowded. And the family bed had the odd occasional extra guest. Not only, but he also was brave enough to be the head of a second family, but was able to always keep the family united and all of us full of love. With this background, you can comprehend how I became adult before time, skipping the teens years altogether. I started working when I was 14, going to evening schools until I got a degree in economics. Thinking back to that time, I realize now that I was sort of driven and put on a sort of automatic pilot, but with a clear view on what I wanted to achieve and become. I wanted a life with economic security and no debits. When I had a family of my own, I became almost obsessed by the idea of having always aside enough money to pay for one year of family expenses. I also wanted a perfect and caring family and convinced myself that I had to have a full control of my passions, so to never repeat what my father did, which I recognized as bad and unworthy. I went on with my life, slowly but steadily improving my career, until I became managing director of a multinational company. On the personal side, I married and had a son. Faithful to my principles, I chose my wife on the basis of reason, so I thought, on a list of qualities that I considered essential for a successful marriage, and also made the decision that I had to love her. When the poor woman, pregnant for the second time and almost ready to give birth, died of an accident, I cannot say that I experienced much grief. I immediately realized that I needed another wife to take care of me and of my son, as overall married life was the best fit for me. And less than 1 year later, having found a suitable partner, I remarried. I never had any affair in my life. I complied with my wife's wishes, both all the stuff that she wanted to satisfy her status and emotional needs, until I started to wake up a bit, slowly realizing that I could not care less of anything material, nor of the exotic holidays, done to show the pictures to our few friends. And something odd started to happen even at work. I can say that for a long time I had been thrilled by my successes and by any change in my position. And the peak was when I was co-opted in the board of directors of the company I worked for. It was a new experience for me. And I started reflecting on what could have caused this change. But I could not find any answer. I decided to become even more aggressive at work, more goal-oriented, but nothing. The uneasiness grew, and I had nobody to confide. I could not admit any weakness in front of anyone. And it continued like this, growing more and more. Until I met Giuseppina. She had similar problems in her life, clinging on to each other for comfort. But this did not help at all to ease my discomfort at work. I became sick. I started having all sorts of symptoms: dizziness, stomach burns, lack of energy, vertigos, and other that I won't mention. I went to the doctors, did all possible exams, but nothing was found. And this went on and on, worse and worse. I was paralyzed. I could not leave my family as it was contrary to what I had based my life on. Good men do not fall prey to passions. Control was everything. At this point, allow me a digression. In the introductory course in the school, at some point, I was told that the wise man is in control of emotions and passions. You remember, probably the second part of the introductory course. Considering that the most important decision in my life was taken, I thought, under the tempest of a strong passion, I could not accept that idea. And in fact, I totally rejected it. I had a bit of a pride. That is that emotions are powerful instruments that must be used, but not repressed at the light of reason. Eventually, after a long, painful internal struggle, and I think just following my survival instinct, I moved out. Everything changed at once. All my symptoms disappeared instantly. My energies had come back. And I had only one but powerful certainty. If I wanted to keep living, I had to leave everything behind. But I was also painfully aware that I hadn't a clue of what I wanted to do. My great luck and strength was that Giuseppina had arrived through a parallel path to the same conclusion. It was easy then to take a decision, to leave everything and everybody, and go in a lonely place to find space and time to rebuild our life. And so we did. We chose one of the remotest places in the earth, Kern Island in the South Pacific, inhabited by 30 people, all descendants of the bounty mutineers of 200 years before. It would take hours to describe in some details that experience, but I'll save you from this. This proved to be the right move. All our material possessions were in a small trunk that accompanied us for the following 10 years. It was a new experience for me, as I always wanted to have stuff and money to feel sure. Instead, for the first time in my life, at the tender age of 50, I felt light and safe. And incredibly, I did not feel any worry for the future, which was objectively totally uncertain. And being out of the world helped us to clear our mind by living and working with the people in need. A pity that we had to wait for other 2 long months to get out of that place, waiting for the first passing cargo ship. There's no time again to go into details of the following 10 years, but I will try to underline fundamental changes that made my life totally different. I began to realize that I did not need any safety box with stuff and money to feel sure and safe. Somehow I knew, and I had so many experiences that confirmed this knowledge, that my material needs would have all been always satisfied. because I felt that I was part of the whole, of the creation, not of a separate little thing in the universe. Once you stop thinking of yourself, of your needs and desires, and this happened to me when I started dedicating myself to the need in front of me, moved solely by love. It becomes natural just to follow the flow of life. And also, when your actions are not motivated by self-interest, you realize that you have energies and knowledge that you didn't know to have. And this was exhilarating. To give you a couple of examples, a missionary friend of mine, whom I had met in Botswana, was sent to a mission in Tanzania, which, among many other things, had a boarding secondary school. He asked us to go with him and help to run the school, as he did not have any experience in that field. And neither we had, honestly. But I said enthusiastically, yes, I'll come. And even though I did not have any significant experience, the results were astonishingly good. And the school became one of the best of the country. Later, I moved to Malawi. I was responsible of a project. I was aware that I had to get it right. So I asked my partner, Sister Josefa, a local nun, to suggest me what to say. She said, Luigi, don't worry, just stand up and let your heart do the talk. I had no choice. I took one deep breath, and the words began to come out from somewhere deep in my heart. And it was a beautiful speech. And it was the beginning of a beautiful love story with Paulo. But I cannot say that we never had any difficult moments. We did. But even then, we did not have any fear of anxiety. Our minds remained always clear, and a way out of trouble always found. If I may, a little final story. We were in Malawi. Giuseppina has a contract as a volunteer with a little pocket money and free accommodation. I was with her as a non-working spouse. This is the technical name. Nothing to do and no opportunities in view. I happened to be inside the organization's office when a man came in. He was an American, director of a large international charity. He started complaining that the consultant he had asked for had not arrived yet, and they could not wait any longer. I raised the finger, and the following day I started working with a gracious international salary that allowed us to buy a nice 20-year-old Toyota Land Cruiser. And believe me, that has been a constant in our life until today. Is it luck? I love to believe it isn't so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luigi. And shall we mention one thing more, that this little part of your life has not only led you to philosophy, but has also led you to setting up the Italian school of philosophy.
Yes.
I mean, is that luck or is that destiny?
Well, it was desperation because I was in the lockdown in London. I didn't have no idea of how to to use my time. And so out of desperation, I started a school in Italy, I think.
So it's done out of desperation, not love. Well, I find that very hard to believe, because everything that you said is entirely out of a sense of love, which is very suitable given that we're going to be considering that next term. Love without limit. Great. Now, we've got about 10 minutes or so before we must end. And that is to put to our three speakers any questions that has arisen in mind whilst they've been speaking. So if you would like to ask a question, you know how to do it. You go down to the bottom here and you look at reactions and you click on raise hand, and then you go up to the top of the list. So I'm going to come out of, I'm going to gallery so I can see you all. Agnieszka, you've got a question. What is it?
Hi guys. First of all, thank you so much everyone for sharing those beautiful stories with us. And Luigi, I have two questions for you, if that's okay. I love listening to you talk. The way you speak and the way you describe the stories, I feel like I'm there. And what I really wanted to ask you is two things, I guess. One is, what was it, whether it was an event or an experience or a thought that suddenly made you think that you don't really care about the materialistic things,
Some things. And so I started to look somewhere for what gave me happiness.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that makes sense. And the second question is kind of related. Is there anything you wish somebody told you at the time, knowing what you know now and bearing in mind the journey you had afterwards? Is there anything you wish somebody told you to kind of make the journey easier maybe or quicker?
Yes, definitely. If I had a friend who knew things, or if I happened to meet the School of Philosophy when I was in my 20s, I would have saved myself a lot of pain.
Thank you, Luigi.
Great. Are there any other questions that you would like to ask, not only to Luigi, but to anybody? Well, it doesn't appear to be any further questions. Is there anything anybody would like to say in response to what you've heard this evening? Yes, Jack. I'll have to ask you to unmute.
I think it was Barbara that, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, Barbara mentioned a lady that she met that she asked what kept her going, the lady that was 100 years old, and she said curiosity. I did hear her saying one time, there's no cure for curiosity, if you got it, but I thought it was quite remarkable that she came up with that word. Could Barbara say more about
that? She was a Japanese woman, but she'd lived in the States and she'd lived a very full life. But that was her mantra, really. So
curiosity.
Yeah, she felt that what she'd done throughout life was to look round the next corner and to take the opportunities that were there, rather than just stand in one place.
Right.
So that's how she sort of viewed her life and how she viewed having a long life and a happy one for her.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Right, well, that's the answer, isn't it? Curiosity.
Yeah.
One of them.
That's what's put us all on this philosophic quest as well. Curiosity. Who am I? Where am I?
Yeah.
What's it all about?
What am I?
David.
I think you said that you were happy to take comments, not just questions.
Yeah, indeed.
So I just wanted to say how interesting all of the talks have been, but in particular, how inspirational I found Luigi's life story to have been. And there's perhaps a lot we can learn from that.
Yeah. It takes courage to step away, doesn't it?
Mm.
And seek a new path. Absolutely. Which, of course, is one of the virtues. Shirley.
Thank you. I just wonder if any of the speakers would be able to say anything more when they used the phrase, I think at least two did, of feeling or knowing that they were part of a whole. I just wondered if there was anything more they could say about that.
Right, anybody would like to respond? I think Luigi mentioned it in his last.
Yes, and Eva.
You could kick it off and then we can hear Eva after.
Well, I think that what helps to go into that direction, to have this experience, is when you stop thinking of yourself and your needs and your wishes. When you move your attention from what your ego tells you, and you watch outside the world, and you stay quiet in silence. And where we were, we had plenty of time, every occasion to stay quiet. It is in this way that you have the experience of being part of some of the creation. But I cannot say in words, because this kind of things can be also experienced and not described in a sense. You feel things, and I'm not able to put them in words.
Well, thank you. Eva, could you respond, please?
In my case, I think it was pretty obvious because my tours were usually between 15 and 20 days. This is long enough to get to know even the people who wouldn't say one word to you, because even you keep observing them, their body language and their interactions with the other people. And you know, after a few years of doing the job, in my case, 36, that it is from the day the tour begins until the day the tour ends, let's say on average 17 days, you are one family and you are moving through various countries in this can of a coach every other day, while those other days you are out visiting new countries. And it is enough one person who is unhappy, who starts sharing their discontentment with others at dinner, for example, when they sit at the groups of 6 or 8, depending on the arrangement of tables in the restaurant, that this discontentment spreads. So in order to make everybody feel a respected and needed member of the family, it was quite a job and a responsibility on my shoulders to keep them content. I told them to begin with that it's not that they can be all happy every day, but that they need to share their happiness. And if they have a problem, to come and tell me there and then. And then I can do something about it. Because if they start talking behind my back, and then eventually after 17 days write down in the comment sheets that was something basically wrong, I would never know, I will never be given a chance to amend it. So that we needed to build trust between the two parties, those running the tour, the driver and myself, and those sitting there behind and having paid a lot of money to come and see Europe. So in a way, that is why I worked out, the system from the pink forms to find out their, little problems. And then responding to those difficulties, I was building trust. And then they were sharing that contentment that I managed to see to their problems, their individual needs. And the group was very, very, in a way, successfully and efficiently becoming really united. And this was for me the greatest joy, because you never knew what kind of situations, even if you knew, by then I knew each of the itineraries, like the palm of my hand, because I would repeat them. But every tour was still different because of the people, their problems, traffic situation, all kinds of weather conditions, problems in the hotels, book outs, what have you. It was never the same tour. So I would tell them that we are all family. I was saying, look, I'm your mama, you come and tell mama. And it was, to tell you the truth, it was working. It was working. I would tell them, I'm here for you to help you, but you need to trust me and tell me there and then. And it would work.
Thank you very much, Eva. That's the lovely answer, and lots of very practical lessons included in that answer. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed these wonderful, wonderful people that have been talking to you this evening and their stories that they have to tell. There's so much to learn from each other, and we're going forward together next term. We're looking forward to that, as I say, on the subject which was paramount this evening, and that is the question of universal love. So at this point, I wish you all good night. If you want to find out any more about the course, you can actually have a look on the school's website. So what would be very nice is to practice what we always practice, and that is coming to rest together. So let's pause. And in that state of stillness and contentment, come completely to rest. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I do hope you've enjoyed